Greetings, magical mavens. You may or may not be aware that I also have a podcast. In fact, most of the videos that you see here also have audio-only versions that you can listen to on any of the main podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But there are also interviews on the podcast that I haven't posted here. Well, for this new season of the podcast coming up, I'll be interviewing guests specifically on, seasons. As you know, aligning my life and practice with the energies of the Sabbats on the Wheel of the Year has been one of the most helpful methods for experiencing more fulfillment on a more consistent basis. And it's always so inspiring to hear how other witches in the community embrace the magic of the seasons in their own unique ways as well. So that's why I've asked some of my colleagues to join me for chats about the Wheel of the Year, with the intention of posting them both on the podcasting platforms and here on YouTube each season. And to kick things off, I invite you to join me and my friend Tenae Stewart, the Witch of Lupine Hollow, for a mind-blowing discussion on how zodiacs and Sabbats are intrinsically linked. And by the way, have you ever wondered why some grimoire pages and Pinterest infographics seem to list seemingly arbitrary herbs as correspondences for the zodiacs or the Sabbats? Well, Tenae is teaching us how, and most importantly, why these correspondences were chosen. Learning this information, especially the parts about astrology, has literally been life-changing for me as a seasonal living enthusiast, and I can't wait for you to hear how it all fits together seamlessly. Seriously, this almost made my brain explode. So if you're curious, I invite you to brew yourself a nice cup of tea or pour yourself a glass of wine, light a candle, and join us for this fascinating witchy chat. Greetings, magical people, and welcome back to the Alchemy of Affluence podcast. I'm Afira, the Writing Witch. So if you are a longtime listener of the podcast, chances are you have already heard at least one episode of the podcast with Tenae. She has come back for a third time. Clearly, she's one of my favorites. She is the author of a few books now, and today we're going to actually be talking about her new book, The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic. Tenae is a cottage witch, a certified astrologer, as well as a coach and an author. I had the honor of getting to read and review Tenae's first book and create an endorsement for it, The Modern Witch's Guide to Self-Care, which you may have already heard of by now. I actually went to the bookstore and I found this on one of the end caps in a prominent area of Barnes & Noble, so chances are you might have already heard of this. Tenae is very thorough in her knowledge of witchcraft, and it's really cool that everything that she does is focused around integrating these things into your own self-care practice so that you are actually not just knowing the correspondences of things like you would see in a book or on a correspondence sheet on Pinterest or something like that, but you're actually understanding what this step has to do with your real life and how you can use it to create a better existence for yourself here on planet Earth. So the new book is called The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic, and I'm really excited about it because it encompasses some of my favorite things, you guys. It talks about how we can combine the Wheel of the Year with moon phases and astrology. I mean, that in and of itself is really exciting because it helps you to take these seemingly different systems and actually realize that they're part of the same system. And then it goes the step further of you actually getting to live the energies of all three of those cycles as you go across your year, which oh my gosh, I could not be more excited about that. But it also is going into how you can work with herbs. So if you are an herbal witch, or if you're like me and you like the concept of herbs but never really got into them because the lists of correspondences that you would find didn't really seem to make sense, this book is going to be for you. So in this episode, we're going to be diving into all of those concepts, and you will actually walk away from this podcast interview hopefully with your mind blown, because honestly, I kind of did. So without further ado, I'm going to stop gushing about how excited I am for this book, and we're going to go ahead and dive into the episode. All right, well, welcome back, Tenae, for I think the third time on the podcast. You're one of those few people that I just keep bringing back because You're the best.
Aw, thank you. I'm excited to be back.
Today, we are really excited because we're going to be talking about not your first, but your second book. So, is astrology going to be a big focus in your new book?
Yes, it is. And I'm very excited about that. So, in my first book, as you know, there's a whole chapter on using astrology to understand your own self-care needs, which was a really fun, really easy chapter for me to write because the astrology aspect of my work just comes very naturally to me. Like it's a language that makes sense to me. And so I had a lot of fun writing that chapter, and it's been one of the chapters I've gotten the most feedback about, that people said they found it really fun and really enlightening. And so I was really excited to kind of expand on ways that you can work with astrology in your life and in your spiritual practice in the new book. So it's a much greater focus in the new book rather than just one chapter. So the new book is called The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic. It's coming out April 2022. And basically the premise is working with the overlapping cycles of the seasons, the moon phases, and astrology or the planets to really be in flow with the collective, like cosmic energy, and with your own energy throughout the year. And so astrology is really the connecting thread. So throughout the book, we're looking at the seasons and the wheel of the year. We're looking at the new and full moons throughout the year. But really the foundation of all of it is we're looking at what signs are the new and full moons in at different times of the year, because there's a pattern to that. It's not random. And we're looking at what signs the sun is in during each season and during each Sabbat or festival during the wheel of the year. And so it's actually all very interconnected when you look at it astrologically. And so I'm really diving deep into that and kind of like, what are the energies and archetypes of every sign and how can we work with them throughout the year, which was really, really fun to write.
I love all of the parts of that because, as you know, I'm obsessed with the seasons. They're kind of like my bread and butter. I love astrology, but it feels like there's so much to it. And it feels like you need to know all these different moving parts. And I know that you have some philosophies on how to make astrology feel just as natural to someone like me, for example, as the wheel of the year does, or to a moon witch as like just working with the cycles of the moon. So would you be able to give us a quick rundown of how all those things are connected and how you actually feel that it's easy to learn or learn a new one of those once you've learned one of the previous cycles?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've actually found that I think it's in a lot of ways easier to learn, either to learn it in that way, right? Like I already know the moon or I already know the seasons, and then to learn astrology as kind of a component. Or if you're brand new to all of them, to kind of learn them all together, because most of us have learned them kind of separately. And it wasn't until I started finding the connections between these three essentially systems or cycles that I was like, oh my God, these are all actually the same thing. Like there's no reason we don't have to break them apart if we don't want to, right? And of course you can work just with the wheel of the year, work just with the moon, or just with astrology. But I've really found in my own practice and for my clients that combining them together can be really powerful. So basically the way that it works is the sun moves through all 12 signs of the zodiac just about once a year. It spends just about 1 month in every sign. And this part's like really easy for most of us to grasp because that's your sun sign, right? So that's your horoscope. If you look up like, oh, I'm a Taurus sun, and it says, April 19th to May 20th or something like that. Like that's the period that the sun spends in that sign. Now it does shift a little bit. It can shift a couple of days in either direction, which is why if you're born on the cusp, like me, you might get frustrated with your horoscope sometimes because it might say the wrong date. And that's why it's important to have your actual birth chart rather than just a horoscope. But the sun spends about 30 days roughly in every sign every year. And so those are what we call astrological seasons. So the sun starts out in Aries in March, and it moves through the 12 signs in the same order every year. And what it's really doing is the sun appears to be in the constellations that are associated with each of those signs at those times of the year. And as the sun moves through these 12 signs, it impacts the way that we experience essentially the sun's power on Earth. So the solstices and equinoxes, which of course are part of the wheel of the year, are actually astrological in nature. So the equinoxes, the spring equinox, can only happen, it can only physically happen when the sun reaches 0 degrees of Aries. And so the spring equinox is this energy of fresh starts and new beginnings. And it's also the astrological new year. It's when the sun reaches the very beginning of the first sign. And so it's sort of this new year energy in all different sorts of ways, right? Both seasonally, things are growing again, and we're starting over at the beginning of the zodiac. And I find that there's a lot of those types of correlations throughout the year. And so there's 12 signs and there's 3 modalities. So basically there's 3 groups of signs that have similar types of energy. So the cardinal signs are the first, and they are the equinoxes and solstices. So when the sun reaches 0 degrees of a cardinal sign, we have an equinox or solstice without fail. So Aries, the beginning of Aries is the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. The beginning of Cancer season in June is the summer solstice. The beginning of Libra season in September is the autumn equinox, and the beginning of Capricorn season in December is the winter solstice. And of course, those are for the Northern Hemisphere, but they're just reversed in the Southern Hemisphere. And so we have these cardinal signs that kind of start the energy of each new season. And we spend, about a month in that energy after the equinox or solstice. And then the sun moves into the next groups of signs, which are the fixed signs. And the fixed signs really sustain us through each season. They carry us through like the peak of the energy of that season. And they also carry us through the fire festivals. So the other 4 Sabbats or festivals in the wheel of the year they all take place during fixed sign seasons. So we have Beltane during Taurus season in the spring. We have, I'm going to get them out of order. We have Lammas in the summertime in Leo season. We have, what's the next one? Samhain. We have Samhain in October during Scorpio season, and then we have Imbolc in February during Aquarius season. And again, that's Northern Hemisphere, but they're just swapped. They're just reversed for the Southern Hemisphere. And so these are the same every year. As the sun moves through these signs, it reaches these certain festivals and markers in the year. And you can work with the wheel of the year without knowing the astrology whatsoever. But I found that connecting them really adds this extra layer of nuance and information, especially for people who struggle to work with the wheel of the year because it feels kind of outdated, right? Or it feels like agricultural and they have trouble connecting with it in that way. And so kind of adding in the astrology is like, well, this makes it more universal. It's an energy that people have been connecting with for thousands of years in all different kinds of contexts. And so then the remaining signs, there's 4 additional signs, are the mutable signs, and they are the transition between the seasons. So there are not festivals or sabbats in the mutable signs, but they actually lead us right up to the next equinox or solstice, the beginning of the next season. And so these are Gemini, transitions us from spring to summer. Virgo transitions us from summer to fall. Pisces transitions us from I missed one. Sagittarius, it's hard to do them out of order like that. Sagittarius transitions from fall to winter, and Pisces from winter to spring. And so it's really helpful to look at the seasons this way and kind of break them down into, okay, it's not just the spring season, right? It's the cardinal energy of spring when we're getting started. It's the fixed energy of spring when we're really at that peak of like blossoming, fertile energy. And then it's the mutable energy as we start to transition into summer, for example. And so that's really the premise of the book, is working through the seasons, understanding which sign we're currently in and what's being activated there. And then I'm also looking at the new and full moons. So in every one of these astrological seasons, we have the new moon is always in the same sign as the sun, and the full moon is always in the opposite sign as the sun. So during Aries season, we'll just stick with that example. During Aries season, sometime in the 4 weeks after the spring equinox, we have the new moon in Aries and the full moon in Libra. And so that full moon energy is really beautiful because it brings in this little dose of the opposite energy, to kind of remind us and give us perspective and balance, which I just really love. I love that little dose of like, another part of the year, another season. So that's really the premise, of the book and of the system that's kind of underlying the foundation of everything.
I love, again, all of the moving parts of that because, like, obviously I'm obsessed with cycles, right? Like, that's kind of my thing. And I was fortunate that when I kind of first discovered the Wheel of the Year, I very quickly found the Witches Zodiac series on YouTube with Zoe Hind and Laura Deligan, where one of them's a witch and the other one is an astrologer, for anyone listening who doesn't know. And they kind of just got together and talked about like the pagan aspects of the Sabbats and what they have to do with the zodiac signs. And that was so helpful to have relatively early in my Wheel of the Year journey, because it just adds a layer of, like, exactly like you said, like, this isn't just something that was done in ancient Europe. Like, this is a concept that kind of goes through all cultures, because these are the energies of simply what is happening in the universe during those times of the year. And that made my brain explode. And then you also just made my brain explode a little bit more, because I remember they kind of quickly mentioned a little bit about like what happens at a solstice astrologically, for example, and an equinox and at a cross quarter. But one thing that I've never understood, or like never committed to memory, at least, about astrology is the different types of signs, right? So like, I understand fixed signs because I'm a fixed sign and my older sister is a fixed sign. So like, I was very like, we're opposite. So like, she's a Leo and I'm an Aquarius. And for a while we were the only two children. So I can very easily understand the concept of that, like opposites, how like every sign has an opposite. And since the fixed signs are kind of like the most potent version of the elements, which elements are a big thing for me, it's very easy for me to understand that. But I've always been like, okay, so I know mutable means changeable, but what does that actually mean on a tangible level? And cardinal, I don't think I think I'm sure I read that it means the start of something, but I never committed that like to memory, like in my practice. So I love that you've just kind of tied all of those seemingly different modalities into one little nutshell, that if you just stick it out for a year, focusing on how they're all playing with each other, like interchangeably, you can kind of understand the entire concept of what it means to work with that plant tend harvest release cycle of manifestation.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think that that's such a good point, that, we have to kind of move through these energies ourselves. Like, we can understand them abstractly, but to really, really embody them and feel them, we have to actually be in them. And, whether it's the moon phases or the zodiac signs or whatever energy it is that you're connecting with, or if you're combining them, really they are just this energy that's happening around us collectively and cosmically. And when you're really in that energy and you are in flow with it, and something I've been talking about a lot lately in one of my groups for clients is that we have this tendency to always be looking ahead, right? We're always looking ahead to like, okay, well, this holiday is coming up next, or, next month I have this thing I have to do. And that's fine, right? Like, that's our lives. And that's how we move through the world. But it can sometimes have us be feeling kind of disconnected from the energy, right? And so using this system to tune in and say, okay, it's Scorpio season, and I know there's a new moon in Scorpio, and that means that we're close to Samhain, and like all of these energies are overlapping one another. You can really, really like just tune in and feel it very intuitively and emotionally and spiritually. And it's really great for that kind of practice of mindfulness and being present with the season, with the weather, with the energy, with everything that's happening around you. Which is just, a great practice in general to help us be more present and mindful in our own lives and in our own bodies. And so, yeah, I absolutely love breaking it down to be as simple as possible, because I actually think that, learning, okay, what is a cardinal sign? Oh, that means it's starting something, right? Like, well, tangibly, what does that mean? Like you said, well, it means it's starting a new season. Like literally that's what it's doing. And so I think for so long, we've kind of learned and taught these systems as separate, like even kind of disparate pieces. It's like, oh, well, I'm into this system and you're into that system. It's like, well, actually all of these systems interlock in really beautiful ways that actually kind of make each other make even more sense in the long run.
Yes, you perfectly described what I meant when I said it made my brain explode, when I realized like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah, like those are the things that kind of bring tears to my eyes as a spiritual, witchy person. Like when things make sense and it clicks together and you can see sort of the mechanics of how the universe works. And especially like in today's day and age where like there's so much division with people having different belief systems. I love it when belief systems cross over and you realize that we're all kind of doing the same thing. Like how many like Abrahamic religions have things that actually follow the moon or follow the sun in some way, and they're kind of glossing that part over nowadays. But back in the day, it was very similar to paganism. So I just kind of wish we could all see that we're kind of all doing the same thing, and kind of like we're merging these concepts in our own practices. It would be cool if we could kind of merge them in society. But I mean, I guess that's what we're doing as we're making podcasts and writing books and inviting more people, with an inviting attitude without saying like, hey, you can't be a witch unless you do it this way, or, you can't be a Muslim and work with moon signs. I love what I love about your brand is that it's very inclusive, and it's not only inclusive of concepts, but it's also inclusive of people, which I think is, as an Aquarius who you talked about always like having our minds in the future, as an Aquarius, I have my mind in the future a lot. And I see a lot of benefit from like modalities coming together and systems that actually work for people instead of like people working for systems. So thank you for doing that and being your amazing self.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means so much. I mean, I totally agree. I think that this philosophy of like, okay, we have all these different cycles within kind of one general community, right? That turns out are all interconnected and that are actually easier to understand and maybe even, more powerful altogether than on their own. I think we can apply that to so many different communities and spaces and concepts. I mean, it's so true that there are so many spiritualities, so many religions, so many just ways of being that have more in common than not. And, we're just so taught to divide them and to keep them separate, when really, maybe we should be opening up to each other and having more conversations and realizing, I know when this absolutely blew my mind too, when I figured some of this stuff out and I'm like, this is very simple. It's very simple. How come no one's talking about this? How come no one's talking about the fact that, the fixed signs are the fire festivals, or there's a full moon in the opposite sign as the sun every single month? Like, how come no one's talking about that? Because it's so magical and so powerful. And I actually I don't know, maybe there's like a little bit of a conspiracy in me somewhere where I'm like, it's almost like this information was separated from us. It's almost like we were kind of broken apart and all these different pieces of information were broken apart. And I think that goes for a lot of religions and spiritualities too, right? That like society has kind of kept us intentionally separate from a higher wisdom and a greater truth. And yeah, as I was really starting to put these pieces together for myself in my own practice and realizing I need to share this, I was just really, really blown away by how all the pieces just seem to be kind of scattered. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's almost like they're these puzzle pieces. And like, I don't know where I heard this in some conspiracy theory somewhere a long time ago, but like there was this idea that like each culture had one piece of the puzzle and they needed to be separate for some reason, whether that was for some sinister control reasons or whether that was actually just because human consciousness needed that separation in order to become aware of ourselves, which I like to believe that that's what it was. But I don't know, that theory has its own problems too. I don't know. But Like, yeah.
So interesting though. Yeah. To
Yeah.
think about.
When you put them all together, you realize that there's kind of a complete picture there.
I love how every culture literally has some kind of mystical or pagan or etc., right? Fill in the blank, like has some kind of practice, even if it's been buried, even if it's far back and mostly forgotten, right? Like we all have some kind of roots in these practices. And I love that. That's so fascinating. Well, I should also say there is one other component to the book before I get like so far down the astrology rabbit hole, because I will. There's one other very important component to the book, and that is that it's really talking about these three systems and cycles. But because it's really important to me for things not to be purely abstract. Like I love the abstract and I love to be in the, let's be in conversation and let's talk about the energies and all of that. But I also, as a Taurus, really think it's so important for things to also be tangible and grounded and really accessible, so we can really feel them and experience them instead of just like think and talk about them, right? And so the other component of the book is that I'm really bringing herbalism in as a way to ground all of this information. And so the beginning of the book has a bunch of different profiles and information about how to make really simple, very easy and accessible types of herbal concoctions, mostly teas and essential oil blends. And then it has profiles of plants associated with each of the zodiac signs. And then the second half of the book is full of recipes for all of the new and full moons throughout the year, all of the Sabbat festivals, all of the seasons in general, that are really specific to not only like what is in season and what kinds of plants do we tend to be drawn to, but also what plants are actually ruled by those particular zodiac signs or those particular seasons or elements. And so it's really, kind of learning these systems as one cohesive and holistic whole, and then using plants to kind of bring them down to earth so that we can really experience them in a very tangible way. So I kind of like to think of, we have the seasons, the moon, the astrology as these like really pillar foundations. And then plants are the way that we can really connect them, kind of as above, so below, not only what's happening in the skies, but really what are we experiencing on earth as well.
That makes so much sense that you're a Taurus and you had to bring like an earth element into it, which like for me, like being an Aquarius, obviously like journaling is my thing because that's very airy. But okay, so here's a question for you. I have never fully connected to those correspondence sheets for herbs where they say like, this is everything that you need to know about this herb. This is the zodiac sign. This is the gender. This is the element. And I think the reason for that is because for me, herbs are all earth element, first of all. And then secondly, even if you wanted to kind of bring other elements and, other concepts into it, which I think makes total sense, whatever resonates with you. But it's like, who's making this up? Where did this come from? And why should we believe in one system of correspondences over any other? So I'm curious, like, do you have kind of like hard and fast rules that you follow for that? Or do you feel that it's somewhat fluid?
I love this question so much because it's such an important one. And it's one that frustrated me for so long too, because so often, even like books that I refer to all the time, right? They very, very rarely do books of correspondences tell you why something is associated with any given sign or element or planet or whatever, right? There's very rarely a why. And which I think is really a larger problem in kind of the witchy and spiritual community in general, which is why, we don't always realize that all of these systems are interconnected, because even if, more people actually do know that and grasp it, we don't always talk about it, which is why I've been so excited to really just kind of blow this open and be like, okay, we're going to talk about all the things. We're going to talk about all the whys. And there is actually a why for correspondences as well. So first of all, I think it's important to note that two things. One, some different cultures do have different correspondences for different plants. So that can be kind of confusing sometimes, right? It's like, well, is it this or is it that? The other really important thing is that it's also very intuitive, right? So I talk about that in the book, that there is kind of a system, there is a rhyme and a reason to why most plants are associated with certain correspondences. But if you feel that something should be associated with a different element or with a different planet, then you should go with that. And I think that's kind of where we get these sometimes, especially with like very common plants, sometimes you'll see different correspondences across different cultures or different groups, because it is intuitive and people do get to decide for themselves, what any given plant or any given crystal or any given anything else is associated with, right? So that's a really important caveat. But the rhyme or reason to correspondences really starts with the elements. And so if you can figure out the element of a plant, you can pretty much figure out the rest from there, or at least you can get close enough to, what feels right for you, whether or not it's what's in the book. So the way that the elements work, and it's so true that like all plants are the earth element, right? Like, and I think that's where a lot of us get kind of hung up sometimes, is it's like, well, isn't it earth? Like, how could it be anything else? But there's actually fairly few plants that are kind of officially considered earth element, because they all are. It's sort of like an asterisk, right? It's this element, but of course it's also earth. So earth element plants that are actually fully officially just earth tend to be plants that are either grown underground, like tubers or, things like that, or plants that we primarily use their roots. So like they might have leaves and flowers, but if we're mostly working with their roots in herbalism, they tend to be associated with the element of earth, because the plant material we're actually using or consuming came directly out of the earth, right? So like there's like some fairly logical reasons. The other elements, so those are relatively rare, because for the most part, we mostly work with leaves and flowers, right? So air plants tend to be plants that are either very like lightweight, like they bend instead of break, right? So like lavender is a really good example, right? It grows on these like really tall, thin stalks, and it blows in the breeze. And it's also very fragrant. So most like really fragrant plants, like a lot of herbs and flowers and things like that, tend to be associated with the element of air, because we experience them through the air element. We experience them through the breeze and through the wind. And so those are probably the most common, are air plants, or not air plants as in the type of plant, but plants associated with the element of air. So then there's, of course, fire plants, which tend to be things that are either very spicy or have like thorns or spikes, things like that. So like cactus and like peppers, things like that, that are going to be hot in some way, right? And then water plants, which makes sense that I was going to say water plants are kind of the most nebulous because it's water, right? So sometimes some like fragrant flowers and things like that will be associated with water, such as rose. And that's because is a little more esoteric, because they're more connected to our emotions. So it's like things with a gentler fragrance, and then things that have a high water content, right? Like aloe, or things that grow on water, like lotus, are associated with the element of water. And so the element is really about the plant itself. Like, how does it grow? Where does it grow? What is its shape? And then once you kind of figure out the element, there are certain planets and certain zodiac signs associated with every element. And so you can usually get it down to at least like 1, 2, maybe 3 signs. And then once you kind of decide, okay, this sign makes the most sense, well, what planet is that sign ruled by? And there's a little bit of nuance here. And, if you go through this process intuitively for yourself, you might come up with a slightly different list than what you might find in a correspondence book. But I also think that that's really powerful too, to kind of do it for yourself and to decide, this is what this means to me.
That does make a lot of sense. And for me, it raises a lot of questions, because now I want to know, so suppose I narrow something down to its element and its type, well, not even its type of zodiac sign, but the zodiac signs related to that element. How would I then decide what actual zodiac sign is it? Does it depend like what season it's grown in, or like the tendency for it to be like a self-starter for cardinal, or, something that sticks around for a long time and kind of has its own energy, like a fixed sign? Like, what is sort of the rhyme or reason to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for example, Things that are ruled by the fire element, right? So the fire signs there's 3 signs in every element. So once you get to the fire, or once you get to the element, you can pretty much get to at least 3 signs, right? So the fire signs are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. So Leo plants are also going to be ruled by the sun, because Leo is ruled by the sun. So Leo plants tend to be like really bright, like sunflowers, like calendula or marigold, like things that are, often they're like yellow or orange. They'll be like brightly colored, often flowers, but not always. And they're warm or spicy, but in like this really uplifting kind of way. So like cinnamon, or like warm spices like that, where like they're spicy, but they're not like aggressive. Does that make sense? And then Aries plants tend to be more on like the kind of spicy, spiky side. So like cactus is more Aries, or like hot peppers, like chili peppers are going to be more on the Aries side. And that's because Aries is ruled by Mars, right? It's the planet of war, the planet of action. And so you can kind of think about like, okay, well, what does this plant really taste like? What does it really do? How does it really kind of show up in the world, right? How do I experience it? And then if you know more about the zodiac signs, which I go into a lot in the book, like what is each sign? What is its energy all about? Then you can kind of decide or figure out, okay, well, this seems more Aries or this seems more Leo. Of course, fire signs also include Sagittarius, which Sagittarius really rules fewer signs. Fewer plants, because it's the mutable fire. And so it's this much more like changeable, like kind of unsettled energy. It's harder to pin down, right? The mutable signs are harder to pin down. And so Sagittarius actually rules some really different kinds of plants. Like it rules dandelion, because even though dandelion, is very airy, its flowers are yellow when it's before they turn into little puffballs. And then their little puffballs, when they blow in the breeze, Sagittarius is the sign of the healer, the sign of the explorer. And so Sagittarius really loves to like go exploring and go for an adventure. And so that energy of the dandelion being able to like really, blow anywhere, is very related to Sagittarius. So usually most plants are ruled by certain signs. There are signs that tend to be less common. Another good example are Gemini and Virgo. So a lot of plants are ruled by Mercury, because a lot of plants are ruled by air, and Mercury is the traditional air planet. But Gemini rules, I'm sorry, get all mixed up. Mercury, get too excited. Mercury rules 2 signs. It rules Gemini and Virgo, but Gemini is the only air sign of the 2. So Gemini is an air sign, Virgo is an earth sign. Mercury rules both of them, but if it's really on the air side, like it's probably going to be Gemini, right? Virgo plants tend to be more like very mild and grounded and calm, like ferns are ruled by Virgo, right? And so there are certain signs and certain planets that kind of tend to be more common. Another important thing is that the modern planets are less common in herbalism, because they were only discovered much more recently. So before the 1700s, the known solar system ended at Saturn. And so pretty much all plants in like Western herbalism are mostly ruled by the sun and moon, and then Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto weren't discovered yet. And so modern astrology and modern herbalism have, kind of added Uranus and Neptune and Pluto in, but they're much less common. So, if you're trying to figure out like, well, what rules lavender, it's probably not going to be one of those 3, for example. So there's some nuance, definitely, but it's a really fun thing to play around with and explore.
That is so interesting. Like my mind was going in a million different directions, like making connections as you were saying that. Yeah, now I'm like actually curious, because admittedly, I'm not much of an herbal witch. Like I am, in the sense that I have like cottage witch aspects in my craft, just since I'm a homebody and I like to make teas and use essential oils and stuff like that. But I tend to do it intuitively, as opposed to using like lists of correspondences. And So now I'm like, okay, now let's get this book, because like now I want to see like, especially because you're someone who I trust. Like I have very similar views to you in other modalities. So it's like, I would like to know Tenae's perspective on herbs. That could be very helpful.
Thanks. It really is such, I mean, it's so cliche, but like such a labor of love. But it really is such a labor of like bringing all of these different components that I loved individually. And when I started to put them together, they just became a whole new thing for me. They opened up so many new avenues in my own practice. And I felt that they really helped me simplify so much. I mean, these are very big topics. I mean, herbalism is a huge topic. Astrology is a massive topic, right? And I really feel like so often we kind of hold ourselves back from those really complex subjects because it feels like, well, that's going to take me a long time to learn. I'm going to have to dive into all of these different things. And, I don't have the time for that, or I don't have the brain space for that. Right. Even if we really feel called to it. And I think really that was me with both astrology and herbalism for a long time. I mean, I've been an astrologer for quite a few years at this point, but when I was younger, I was always really drawn to it. Like I had this little Taurus necklace that I always wore like in middle school, like I always loved it, but it felt like something that I couldn't possibly learn. I couldn't possibly understand, and even herbalism was that way too, until I really realized like it can be as simple as, choosing 3 oils to put in my diffuser, or, choosing a couple of herbs to blend together and drink a cup of tea, and do that, with a magical intention, with a healthful intention, with a mindful intention, or all of the above, and it really can be so very simple. And so that was really a huge part of the inspiration for this book was number one, wanting to, share these topics that I'm so excited, so passionate about, but also wanting to make them more accessible for people, because I really feel like a lot of the resources out there, I think there's becoming more and more accessibility, especially around astrology, and more people are starting to, really see it as this amazing and really magical language. But it still often feels like something that's very overwhelming. And so I really wanted to present all of these topics in a way that's more accessible, more approachable, and just really simpler to understand, simpler to fit into our real lives, instead of like feeling like you have to take a year off to learn astrology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, are there any links like sequel style between your first book and your second book? I know the first one is all about just like self-care and some like a lot of elements, I think, of cottage witchcraft, which you identify as a cottage witch, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So like, are there ties between that, or is it kind of just like this is the next level if you want to learn like the reasons behind the correspondences?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely some connections, like they're kind of subtle connections, but I really wanted this new book, even though it's really focused on, okay, let's learn how to make teas together and that sort of thing, let's learn what is astrology. I still wanted it to really have that kind of wellness and self-care focus, because that's really, really my approach to my work. In my own life and practice, I identify as a cottage witch, and that kind of cozy, like simple, grounded approach to magic definitely ties through both books. Like that's just who I am, right? But also in my work, I really, really am here to help people create practices that are both spiritual and self-care, to be able to embody their most magical self, by really taking care of their mind, their body, their intuition, right? All of these different elements kind of put together. And so it is definitely kind of a subtle common thread throughout the new book is the reason we're doing this, right? The reason we're tuning into the seasons, the reason we're flowing with the moon cycles, the reason we're choosing to work with plants, like all comes back to how can we nourish ourselves? How can we take care of our minds, our bodies, and our intuition, both spiritually and physically too.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm thinking about like old correspondence books where it's like, okay, they kind of tell you why because they link it between, elements and seasons and stuff like that. But what about the actual why should I care? You know what I mean? So I love that about your content.
Thank you. Exactly. I mean, I think that's such an important piece, right? Is so often we kind of get into, okay, I'm going to like learn all this stuff and I'm going to get into magic. And then we kind of can lose ourselves along the way, right? It's like, well, why am I doing this? Why does this matter to me? I know I'm supposed to be doing a full moon ritual and I'm supposed to be celebrating Samhain and I'm supposed to be doing all these things, right? Which as a witch, there's nothing you are supposed to do. There's nothing you have to do. There's nothing you can't do, right? But we feel that way very often. Even experienced witches, we get into that like, oh, it's the full moon, I should do that, and the shoulds are never helpful. But when we can really understand like, oh, if I flow with the moon phases, it helps me in this way and this way, which for me, right, like the moon phases are about energy management. They're about how can I know kind of where my energy is going to be at different parts of the month and on any given day. The seasons is very spiritual, right? That's very devotional for me in a lot of ways. Like I've always, like you, really been attracted to the seasons and really, really flowed with that and really been kind of energized by the changes in the seasons. Like I know that that's something that feels very fulfilling for me. The astrology for me helps me kind of understand the world around me. It really is a language. It's something that I can apply to any situation and say, oh, this is happening and it's being reflected in this way in the cosmos, right? And so understanding those whys, both kind of collectively and for yourself, is just so powerful. Instead of, creating a practice that's full of a bunch of supposed tos and shoulds, it's full of, okay, I'm choosing to use this system and that system for this particular reason.
I love all of this. I could just literally pick your brain forever. So I guess for a takeaway, because I mean, my why factor for why I want to read this book is because I already kind of understand like the cycles, and now I want to know what they have to do with herbs. So like, what are kind of the main takeaways that you want people to get from books or from your books in general, but especially this one? Like, is this for people like me who are already seasoned witches but want to deepen their practice? Is it for beginners? Is it for both? Or like, what are kind of the intentions for the book?
Sure. Yeah, I would say it's for both. Like you're going to kind of access different layers of information depending on what your experience is. So it definitely is accessible for beginners. And we're introducing the wheel of the year. We're talking about it from the very beginning. So if you're brand new, like it's definitely going to be accessible in that sense. You're going to get kind of an introduction to the wheel of the year, an introduction to astrology. The herbalism is very, very simple. Like we're not doing anything complicated. There's like a few like cooking and baking recipes in there, just a couple really simple recipes. There's lots of tea blends, very easy to do, lots of essential oil blends, very simple. Like it's very approachable. So if you're brand new to any of these systems, like it's really designed for you to be able to get started with them. But if you are more advanced, like I also wouldn't say that it's a 101 book exactly, mostly because it's really, kind of deepening our understanding of how do all these cycles intersect, how do they overlap? And I feel like there's very few 101 books out there that actually talk about all three of these cycles, or all four for including herbalism, in depth. And so I really tried to go deep with it and not to just stay on the surface. So I would say it's definitely approachable and accessible for all levels. And if you are more advanced, it's going to help you to really connect what are probably already different aspects of your practice. Most of us are working with the seasons and the moon, and maybe we're starting to dabble with astrology, right? Maybe you love to make tea, but you don't understand how they connect. And this is really going to help you kind of draw those connections for yourself. So I would say that's definitely, in terms of like who it's for, it's definitely for both. And then definitely the biggest takeaway is how flowing with these cycles, and whether you choose to, combine them all the way I do, or if you choose to work with one or a couple of them, right? Flowing with these cycles is really about, mindfully being present with the energy around you and understanding how it impacts you personally, which I think is such a big thing, right? It's not just like, oh, it's the autumn season, and so here's the energy and this is what you're supposed to be feeling, right? Like that's really not the point. The point is to reflect and be like, how does this energy feel for me? How do I feel at this time of year? And then it's presenting recipes and ideas and suggestions to use in that season, but it's really meant to be very intuitive as well. So definitely the biggest takeaway would be how flowing with these seasons and cycles and the moon and astrology can really nourish and support you.
I love that. And I'm almost thinking about like how that could apply for a real person. So would it be a good example to say that, like, as an Aquarius, I'm here to break the rules, right? Not necessarily follow them. So is it one of those things where once you know what the quote unquote rules are, then you'll understand why you feel the need to break them? Like for example, I think one time a few years ago, I made like a spell jar that contained things that reminded me of the summer, but I did it at midwinter. And I knew the reason for that was not because I wanted to ignore the winter season or not to honor it, but because I know that part of the energy of the winter solstice season is to remind yourself that the light is going to return, right? So I kind of used herbs and crystals and symbols that you wouldn't normally pick for that time of the year, but I was doing it because I kind of knew what rules I was breaking and what it meant to me. So like, is that kind of what you mean by using it intuitively?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely something I touch on in the book as well, that, the recipes in the book are all designed to channel the energy of the season, only because, it could go in a million different directions and the book could be 10,000 pages. But so the recipes in there are designed to channel the energy of each season and moon phase. But you can apply the same principles to create balance. You can choose the opposite plants to balance out the energy if you're feeling overwhelmed by it. Or you can, just choose things intuitively. They don't have to be aligned with the season and just say, this is how this energy is showing up for me now. There's so many different ways that you can really work with this. And I totally agree that once you kind of understand these very foundational things, right, about what signs the new and full moons are in every single month, you can predict it. You can know, you don't even have to look. Once you know what it's going to be. What signs are showing up for each Sabbat and each festival. You just kind of, you understand these building blocks, right? They're really just the foundation. And then you can make your own decisions. It's not just like, okay, let's flip through this book and make every recipe in exactly the order it's presented. It's not a cookbook. Like it's intuitive. It's so intuitive. So yes, I absolutely love that once you understand the basics, you get to flow in whatever directions resonate with you.
Yeah. And it's been actually really helpful hearing on your podcast about why there's like a full moon in one sign and then the new moon in the opposite sign each season, because that perfectly illustrates like why it's important to bring balance in during any time of the year. So I just love how all these things tie together. It makes me so happy.
Me too.
For anyone who doesn't know where to find you, like what are you doing right now that they can dive into before they get the book, and like where can they get more of your magic?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on my website. It's witchoflupinehollow.com. And everything's there. You'll find my Facebook and Instagram and everything on the website as well. On the website, we have a couple of really cool free offerings right now. There's a really fun quiz, and there's a free class all about the moon phases. So some fun free stuff to dig into, and also lots and lots of articles and videos and all kinds of content about all of these subjects. So lots of things to play around with there. You can also pick up my first book on the website, as well as check out all of the other things I offer, which are many and varied. But the main thing that I do is I offer the Starlight Coven, which is a seasonal circle for modern witches who want guidance with all of these themes. So who really want to learn how to practice consistently and confidently with the seasons, moon phases, and astrology. So we learn all about different types of magic every month. It's a really, really fun space. So that's right there on my website as well in the main menu. And then the new book, order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the places. So wherever you like to get your books.
Yes, everybody, if what we talked about today was really interesting to you, like it was to me, I really hope that you go to Amazon and leave a review as soon as you can, because it really does help authors to get their book found in the algorithm. Well, thank you so much for being here. You're always welcome on this podcast, and I hope everybody had their mind blown as much as I did, and I guess I'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was really informative for me. And now I really want to know, what was your biggest takeaway from this episode? Are you somebody who's brand new to all of this stuff, or have you dabbled in certain ones of these modalities but didn't necessarily know you could put them together in this way? Or literally anything else that popped into your head during this episode? I would love to invite you to leave a comment, and I'd love to get a conversation started here on YouTube. And of course, if you want to continue the conversation, then I invite you to join me for the Alchemy of Affluence membership, and the information for how to join will be below. And if you are a big podcast fan, then here is a playlist for you where I'm compiling the podcast. This is a growing list. There's new episodes being made right now, and there's also old episodes that I'm still in the process of uploading. So I invite you to subscribe and hit the bell button so that you find out when they get added to the playlist. Thank you so much for being your magical self, and until next time, blessed be.